Pull up Google Maps right now. Zoom into any major city. Pick one, anyone. Now switch to Street View and walk yourself down the oldest street you can find. Look at the doors. Not the architecture, not the columns or the carvings, just the doors. Notice anything. Some of them don't open onto the street. They open below it. You have to descend to reach them. And those aren't service entrances. Those aren't loading docks. Those are front doors, grand ones, with fanlights and stone frames and brass fittings. The kind of door you put on the face of a building you're proud of. The kind of door you design to be seen. So why is it underground? That question sounds small. It isn't. Because once you start pulling that thread across cities, across continents, across centuries, you end up somewhere the textbooks never took you. You end up staring at a gap in history so large, so consistent, and so strangely quiet that the silence itself becomes the loudest thing in the room. We're going to go there today, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you will never look at a city the same way again. Let's get something straight before we go any further. This video is not going to tell you what happened. It's going to show you what exists, physical, documented, measurable, and ask you why the standard story doesn't account for it. Here's the pattern. Everywhere on Earth where humans have built cities that we call old, and even some we call new, there is a recurring architectural fingerprint. First floors that were clearly designed to be at ground level, but aren't anymore. Window sills that sit at ankle height. Staircases that descend from the sidewalk into what should be a lobby. Grand civic buildings whose entry level requires you to go down before you go in. Walk through Edinburgh, walk through Amsterdam, walk through the older neighborhoods of Philadelphia or Cincinnati. You'll find it, again and again and again. Now the accepted explanation is simple. Cities accumulate debris. Centuries of foot traffic, construction waste, ash, biological matter, it piles up. Streets get repaved, raised slightly each time. Over hundreds of years, the ground level rises. Makes sense, right? It does, until you start looking at the numbers. The kind of submersion we're talking about in many of these cities isn't inches. It's feet, multiple feet. In some cases, the buried floor is 2, 3, even 4 meters below modern street level. For natural accumulation to account for that depth, you'd need an extraordinary amount of time, or an extraordinary amount of material, or both. And here's what makes this more than just a curiosity. The timing. Across cities with no meaningful contact with each other, separated by oceans, by mountain ranges, by entirely different languages and political systems, this burial appears to happen within roughly the same window of history. The late 18th to mid-19th century, over and over, in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas, the same depth, the same period. The same silence in the documentary record about how it got there. That's not accumulation, that's an event. Before we go further, we need to talk about something that most history classes never mention. Open an old map, not a modern reproduction, an actual period map from the 1600s or 1700s. You can find them in archives, in libraries, on digitized collections from universities around the world. Look at the massive central landmass of Eurasia, stretching from Eastern Europe all the way to the Pacific coast of Asia. What do you see written there? Tartaria or Tartary, sometimes Grand Tartary, covering an area that dwarfs any empire we study in school, larger than the Roman Empire at its peak, larger than the Mongol Empire, which we're taught was the biggest land empire in history, stretching from roughly modern-day Ukraine all the way across Siberia, Central Asia, and into China's borders. It's on map after map after map. Dutch cartographers, French cartographers, British, Portuguese, Spanish from the 1500s through the early 1800s, and then in the span of just a few decades it vanishes, not gradually, not through the slow cartographic revision you'd expect from political change, it just stops appearing. Now the mainstream answer is that Tartary was never a unified political entity, that it was a geographic label, a catch-all term Europeans used to describe the vaguely understood peoples of Central and Northern Asia, a placeholder name for the unknown, and there's some truth to that. The word Tartar was a medieval European shorthand for Mongol and Turkic peoples. But that explanation has a problem. Because maps don't assign populations, borders, capitals, and administrative subdivisions to vague geographic placeholders, and some of these maps do exactly that. They show Muscovite Tartary as distinct from Chinese Tartary as distinct from independent Tartary. They show cities, trade routes, political demarcations. These aren't drawings of a fog, they're drawings of somewhere. So what happened to it? That's the question at the heart of this entire rabbit hole, and the mud flood theory offers a startling answer. The term sounds almost comical, mud flood, like something from a children's book, but strip away the label and look at what it actually describes, and it becomes anything but. A mud flood, as the theory goes, is a rapid, large-scale inundation, not of water but of sediment-laden liquid. Think of it like this. Imagine a laha, which is the geological term for a volcanic mudflow. When a volcano erupts and melts a glacier or triggers heavy rainfall, the resulting mixture of water, ash, and earth can move at the speed of a river, burying everything in its path under meters of material within hours. Now scale that up, not to one volcano, not to one region, scale it to a continent, or to the entire globe. That is what some researchers, independent historians, amateur geologists, alternative archaeologists have been arguing for the past decade or so, that somewhere between the 17th and 19th centuries, a catastrophic event deposited massive quantities of sediment across inhabited areas worldwide, an event so rapid that it didn't destroy cities so much as bury them, in place, intact, sealed under a new layer of earth. And then they argue the survivors, or the powers that followed, built on top. Literally, they dug out what was useful, adapted what they found, told new stories about where it all came from and called it civilization. Is there actual geological support for something like this? Partially. There are documented phenomena that could theoretically contribute to large-scale sediment deposition, meltwater events following glacial periods, massive volcanic winters that destabilize ecosystems and trigger landscape transformation, the kind of deep flooding associated with rapid changes in sea level. None of these individually look like what the mud flood theory describes, but none of them are impossible either. The question is whether any of them coincide with the architectural and historical anomalies we're looking at, and that question is very much open. Here is where this stops being abstract and becomes something you can actually verify. Go look at photographs of American cities from the 1860s, not illustrations, photographs. You can find them easily. The Library of Congress has thousands of them. City historical societies from Boston to St. Louis to New Orleans. Look at the buildings. These are cities that, by official record, were founded in most cases within living memory of the photograph. Cincinnati was incorporated in 1802, Indianapolis in 1821, Chicago in 1837. Some of these cities are barely 30 years old when the camera first points at them. And yet the buildings look ancient. Not just old, ancient. Monumental neoclassical facades with rows of columns and intricate stone carvings, towering civic buildings with domed rotundas and symmetrical wings, hospitals and universities that look like they belong in imperial Rome, libraries that look like they were copied, stone for stone, from buildings that took generations to complete in European capitals. The workforce available to build these cities was, by all accounts, small, transient, and largely unskilled. Immigrant labor arriving by the boatload with no common language, no shared craft tradition, no accumulated guild knowledge, and the tools at their disposal were hand tools, chisels, hammers, rudimentary cranes, horse-drawn carts. Yet the results look uniform, not just aesthetically similar, technically identical in ways that don't make sense if each city developed independently. The same column proportions, the same cornice details, the same approach to ceiling vaulting and interior ironwork, as if there was a single source from which all of it was drawn. One explanation: they all hired architects trained in the same European tradition. They all made the same choices independently. Another explanation: they didn't build these buildings. They found them. And they built around them, on top of them, into them, and then wrote a founding story that began after the finding. Here's something that tends to get glossed over in urban history. The mid to late 19th century was a catastrophic period for cities by fire, not one or two isolated disasters, a sustained global wave of urban conflagrations. Chicago 1871, Boston 1872, Seattle 1889, Jacksonville 1901, Baltimore 1904, San Francisco 1906, that's just North America. Across Europe and Asia, similar stories. Moscow, Constantinople, Smyrna. One after another, the oldest and most architecturally complex urban cores burn to the ground. And then something strange happens. They get rebuilt, fast, not in the decades you'd expect if you were starting from scratch with the resources of the era, in years. And the rebuilt cities are, without exception, more organized, more rationalized, and more modern than what preceded them, as if the fire cleared space for a new layout that had already been planned. Now consider this. What if some of these fires didn't destroy buildings so much as clear the surface? What if what burned was the accumulated material, the wooden additions, the temporary structures built on top of and around something older that still stood underneath? What if the rebuilding wasn't construction so much as uncovering, excavating, cleaning out, adapting what remained, and then laying a new street plan over it? In Chicago, the famous pedway system runs through tunnels that predate the Great Fire. Some basement levels of buildings in the loop are accessed from street level today, but were, by the accounts of early Chicago residents, above ground before the city was raised. There are layers there, multiple layers. and the official story accounts for only some of them. Let's come back to Tartary. If there was a civilization, or a network of civilizations, occupying the vast interior of Eurasia in the centuries before our accepted historical narrative takes over, what would we expect to find? We'd expect architectural remnants in the Siberian interior that don't fit the timeline of Russian colonial expansion. There are some structures in the Ural region with stone foundations that predate the towns officially built on top of them. We'd expect old maps to show it, and they do until they suddenly don't. We'd expect a consistent architectural vocabulary showing up across wildly disparate geographies, as if all of it came from a common source. And we have that in the suspicious uniformity of 19th century civic architecture from Philadelphia to Vienna to St. Petersburg. We'd expect some kind of cultural memory passed down in fragmented form of a world that was erased. And we have that too in every mythological tradition on Earth that speaks of a flood, a destruction, a reset, a time before when the world was different, then a catastrophe, then survival, then rebuilding. None of this is proof, let me be clear about that. None of this, individually or collectively, constitutes hard evidence for a global civilization called Tartary that was buried under a mud flood in the early modern period. The evidence is circumstantial. The pattern is suggestive. The anomalies are real, but they could have conventional explanations we simply haven't found yet. But here is what is undeniable. The questions are real, the buried flaws are real, the missing construction records are real, the implausibly rapid building timelines are real, the suspicious uniformity of 19th century architecture across unconnected cities is real, the wave of catastrophic fires followed by suspiciously rapid and sophisticated reconstruction, that is real. And the almost complete absence of serious institutional inquiry into any of it, that is perhaps the most real thing of all. You might be asking, even if all of this is true, why does it matter today? Whatever happened, happened. The cities are here, we are here, history moves on. But I'd push back on that. Because if we inherited a world we didn't build, if the infrastructure of civilization, the techniques of architecture, the organizational capacity required to manage cities at scale, were not independently developed from scratch by our ancestors, but were instead discovered, adapted, and quietly obscured, then we are missing something fundamental about ourselves. Knowledge is not just information, it's context. It's the understanding of where things come from and why they work the way they do. When you lose the origin of a technique, you don't just lose history, you lose the ability to fully understand the technique itself. You lose the thread back to first principles. We are today surrounded by buildings from the 19th century that we can admire but struggle to replicate, not for lack of materials, not for lack of money, because we have genuinely lost the craft knowledge required to produce that level of ornamental stonework at scale. The guilds are gone, the apprenticeship systems are gone, the accumulated intergenerational transmission of skills, gone. Where did that knowledge come from originally? When did it develop? And did it develop, or was it received? These are not conspiracy theory questions, they are history questions, and they deserve to be asked with the same rigor we apply to every other area of serious inquiry. I want to leave you with an image. Somewhere in your city, maybe a few blocks away, maybe a train ride, maybe a short flight, there is a building with a door that doesn't quite make sense. A door that opens below street level. A window that looks out at a wall of compacted earth. A first floor that, by every indication of its design, was meant to stand in open air and receive the light and foot traffic of a functioning street. And it doesn't because something changed. The ground rose, or was raised, or was filled in. And nobody talks about it because the official story has already been told, and it doesn't include this building and what it implies. But the building is still there, waiting, patient in the way that only stone can be patient. The question of what buried it is not a fringe question. It's not a conspiracy. It's an architectural fact sitting in plain sight on nearly every continent, pointing backward at something we don't have a good name for yet. Tartary mud flood, global reset, call it whatever you want. Just don't call it answered. Because the only thing more remarkable than the buried flaws is the fact that for this long, almost nobody thought to ask why they're there. If you're still thinking about this, if that image of the buried door is still in your head, good, hold on to it, follow it somewhere, because that discomfort you're feeling isn't paranoia. It's pattern recognition. And historically, that's exactly how discovery starts.